someone who has traveled further along the path of awakening, someone whose awareness is more refined, whose understanding is deeper, whose presence is more integrated than your own. And the experience is peculiar because it does not always feel the way you might imagine it would feel. It does not always feel inspiring or uplifting or encouraging. Very often, in fact, it feels deeply uncomfortable, even threatening, even destabilizing in ways you did not anticipate. Now, before I describe what actually happens in such an encounter, let me first address what most people imagine will happen, because the imagination and the reality are often quite far apart. Most people, when they think about meeting someone more awakened than themselves, imagine it will be like meeting a sage or a saint, someone who radiates peace and wisdom and unconditional love, someone in whose presence they will feel immediately better, more calm, more centered, more understood. They imagine the encounter will be validating, affirming, will confirm that they are on the right path, will provide guidance and encouragement and support. And sometimes, certainly, encounters with more awakened beings do have these qualities, but very often they do not. Very often what happens is something altogether different, something far more challenging, something that strips away your comfortable self-image rather than confirming it, something that reveals your remaining unconsciousness rather than celebrating your progress. Let me describe the various things that can happen when you meet someone genuinely more awake than you are. The first thing that often occurs is an immediate, visceral recognition that you are in the presence of something different, something other, something more. This is not necessarily a conscious recognition. You may not be able to articulate what you are sensing, but something in you knows. Something in you recognizes that this person is operating from a different place, seeing from a different perspective, living from a different center than you are. This recognition can manifest in various ways. You may feel suddenly more present, more alert, as though the person's consciousness is somehow pulling you into greater awareness. You may feel seen in a way you are not accustomed to being seen, not judged or evaluated, but simply witnessed with a clarity that is both comforting and disconcerting. You may feel transparent, as though your usual defenses and pretenses do not work with this person, as though they can see through the persona you present to the world straight to the reality beneath. And this transparency, this sense of being seen clearly, it can be quite uncomfortable, because most of us are not accustomed to being truly seen. We are accustomed to our performances being taken at face value, to our personas being mistaken for our actual selves, to being able to hide behind our carefully constructed images. But in the presence of someone genuinely awake, these constructions become obvious, transparent, and you cannot hide behind them anymore. The second thing that happens is that your own remaining unconsciousness, your own unexamined patterns, your own ego structures, they become suddenly glaringly visible. It is as though the person's clarity illuminates your remaining darkness. Their presence highlights your absence. Their integration reveals your fragmentation. You may find yourself becoming defensive without quite knowing why. You may feel the need to prove yourself, to demonstrate your own understanding, to show that you too are awake, that you too have realized important truths. You may feel competitive, wanting to match their insights with your own, their experiences with your own, their depth with your own. Or you may feel the opposite, feel suddenly small, inadequate, as though you have been fooling yourself about your own progress, as though whatever understanding you thought you had is revealed as shallow, partial, incomplete. You may feel like a child in the presence of an adult, like someone playing at awakening in the presence of someone who actually embodies it. Both of these responses, the defensive proving and the inadequate shrinking, they are ego responses. They are the ego sensing a threat to its position, its story about itself, its claim to understanding. And the more awakened person need not do anything to provoke these responses. Their mere presence, their quality of being, it is enough to trigger all of your remaining ego structures to reveal themselves. And this is actually one of the great gifts of such encounters, though it does not feel like a gift in the moment. Because these ego structures, these remaining pockets of unconsciousness, they were there all along. You simply were not seeing them clearly. The more awakened person's presence acts like a mirror, reflecting back to you what you have not yet seen in yourself, what you have not yet addressed, what remains to be integrated. The third thing that often happens is that all of your spiritual ideas, all of your concepts about awakening and enlightenment and consciousness, they are revealed as just that: ideas, concepts, mental constructs, not the reality itself, but your thoughts about reality. And the gap between your concepts and the living reality embodied by the more awakened person, this gap becomes painfully apparent. You may have spent years reading spiritual texts, studying various traditions, developing sophisticated understanding of non-duality or emptiness or presence or whatever framework you have been working with. And you may have thought you understood these things, may have been able to explain them eloquently, may have believed you had genuinely grasped them, but in the presence of someone who actually embodies these realities rather than simply thinking about them, you realize the enormous difference between knowing about something and actually being it. You realize that all of your understanding has been largely conceptual, mental, theoretical, while what this person has is direct, immediate, lived. It is rather like the difference between someone who has read extensively about swimming and someone who actually swims. The person who has read about swimming may know a great deal, may be able to describe proper technique in elaborate detail, may understand the physics and biomechanics involved. But put them in water next to someone who actually swims, and the difference is immediately, glaringly obvious. This can be deeply humbling, even humiliating, because you realize that what you thought was substantial understanding is revealed as relatively superficial knowledge. You have been collecting ideas about awakening rather than actually awakening. And this realization can be quite devastating to the part of you that has been invested in your spiritual identity, in your self-image, as someone who is advanced on the path, who understands these matters, who has achieved significant realization. The fourth thing that commonly occurs is a strong temptation to respond in one of two extreme ways: either to idealize the person, to make them into a perfect guru or teacher or master, to project onto them a kind of superhuman wisdom and perfection, or to dismiss them entirely, to find fault with them, to convince yourself that they are not actually more awake than you, that you were mistaken in your initial recognition, that in fact you understand things they do not. Both of these responses are ways of managing the discomfort of the encounter, ways of defending the ego against the threat it perceives. If you idealize the person, put them on a pedestal, make them into something other than human, then you can maintain the distance between you and them. They are special, extraordinary, essentially different from you, and therefore you need not feel badly about the gap between their realization and your own. They are a category apart. If you dismiss them, find reasons why they are actually not more awakened, point to their flaws or limitations or the ways they fail to match your concept of what an enlightened person should be, then you can also defend your ego. You can convince yourself that the uncomfortable feelings they triggered in you were not actually about your own remaining unconsciousness, but about their deficiencies, their problems, their failures to live up to the standard. Neither of these responses allows you to actually learn from the encounter, to receive what is being offered, to allow the person's greater clarity to illuminate your remaining darkness. Both are defensive maneuvers that protect you from having to face what the encounter is revealing about yourself. The alternative, the more difficult but more fruitful response, is to stay with the discomfort, to allow yourself to feel small or inadequate or exposed, to resist both the temptation to idealize and the temptation to dismiss, and to simply be present to the gap between where you are and where this person is, to allow that gap to teach you, to show you what remains to be seen, to be integrated, to be understood. The fifth thing that happens in such encounters is that you are invited, usually without any explicit words being spoken, to let go of something, to let go of your spiritual identity, your investment in being someone who understands, your attachment to your current level of realization, your need to be seen as awakened or advanced or special. This invitation is often experienced as a kind of death, a dying of the self you have been constructing, the spiritual self, the self that has been proud of its understanding and its progress and its insights. And ego does not want to die, even the spiritual ego, perhaps especially the spiritual ego, because it is so invested in being conscious, being awake, being aware. The more awakened person, simply by their presence, by their being, they issue this invitation to die, to let go, to surrender what you think you know, what you think you are, what you think you have achieved. They do not usually do this deliberately or manipulatively. It simply happens naturally, as a function of the difference in realization between you. And you can refuse this invitation. Most people do, most of the time. You can maintain your defenses, protect your self-image, leave the encounter with your ego structures intact, perhaps even strengthened by the need to defend against what you perceived as a threat. But if you accept the invitation, if you allow the dying to happen, something extraordinary can occur. When you let go of your spiritual identity, when you stop trying to be someone who is awakened or enlightened or conscious, when you simply allow yourself to not know, to be confused, to be lost, to be a beginner again, then there is space for something real to emerge. Not your ideas about awakening, but actual awakening. Not your concepts about presence, but actual presence. Not your understanding about truth, but actual truth. The sixth thing that can happen, though it does not always happen, is what might be called transmission. This is a difficult thing to describe because it occurs beyond the level of words and concepts, beyond the level of conscious understanding. It is something that passes from one being to another, not through teaching or explanation or intellectual communication, but through presence itself, through the quality of consciousness that the more awakened person embodies. You may sit with them in silence and find that something shifts in you, something relaxes, something opens, something clarifies, without any words being spoken, without anything obvious occurring. Or you may have a conversation about ordinary matters, nothing particularly spiritual or profound, and yet afterwards you find that you see things differently, that some understanding has deepened, that some pattern has loosened its grip. This transmission is not something the person does to you or gives to you. It is more like a resonance, like a tuning fork causing another tuning fork to vibrate at the same frequency. The more awakened person's consciousness, their quality of presence, it creates a field, an atmosphere, and when you are in that field, your own consciousness has the opportunity to resonate with it, to recognize itself in it, to remember what it truly is, beneath all the conditioning and patterns and identifications. But this transmission can only occur if you are open to it, if you are not too defended, not too invested in maintaining your current state, not too identified with your spiritual self-image. It requires a kind of receptivity, a willingness to be affected, to be changed, to let something in that may alter you in ways you cannot predict or control. The seventh thing that often happens is that whatever spiritual practice you have been doing, whatever methods or techniques or disciplines you have been following, they are called into question. Not necessarily through any criticism or judgment from the more awakened person, but simply through the recognition that what they embody seems to have little to do with practice in the way you understand it. You may have been meditating for years, or doing yoga, or following some particular spiritual discipline, And you may have invested a great deal of your identity in being a practitioner, being someone who is dedicated to the path, being someone who puts in the effort and does the work. And then you meet someone who is clearly more awake than you, and you may discover that they do not practice in the way you do, or perhaps do not practice at all in any formal sense. And yet they have what you are seeking. This can be deeply disorienting, because if practice is not the key, if effort is not what produces awakening, then what have you been doing? What has all your discipline and dedication been for? You may feel betrayed by your practice, by your teachers, by the very framework you have been operating within. But what is actually being revealed is not that practice is useless, but that practice can become another form of ego, another way of trying to become someone, to achieve something, to get somewhere. The more awakened person reveals that awakening is not the result of accumulating practices and experiences and insights. It is something else entirely, something that occurs when all the accumulating stops, when the trying ceases, when you give up the project of becoming awakened and simply are what you already are. This does not mean you should abandon your practice. Practice may still be valuable, may still serve a purpose in preparing the ground, in creating conditions, in wearing away the edges of ego. But the relationship to practice must change. It must cease being a means to an end, a way of getting somewhere, and become instead a simple expression of what already is, a celebration rather than a strategy. The eighth thing that happens, and this can be both discouraging and strangely encouraging, is that you recognize how much further there is to go, how much more is possible, how vast the territory of awakening actually is. Before this encounter, you may have thought you had come quite far, had achieved significant realization, were perhaps even close to some final understanding or complete awakening. But meeting someone genuinely more awake reveals that what you thought was far along the path is actually still quite early. That what you thought was deep understanding is actually relatively superficial. That the territory extends far beyond what you had imagined. And while this can be discouraging, while it can make you feel as though you have accomplished less than you thought, it can also be oddly liberating, because if there is much further to go, if the territory is vaster than you imagined, then you can let go of the pressure to have arrived, to be finished, to have it all figured out. You can be a beginner again, can return to not knowing, can approach the path with fresh curiosity rather than the burden of thinking you are supposed to be advanced or accomplished or realized. There is a particular kind of relief in recognizing that you do not know as much as you thought you did, that you have not progressed as far as you believed. The pressure to maintain the image of someone who is awakened, who understands, who has realized important truths, this pressure can be enormous. And when it is revealed that this image is just that, an image, a construction, a false claim, there is a kind of freedom in the revelation, painful though it may be. The ninth thing that arises in such encounters is the question of relationship. When you meet someone more awake than you, there is often an impulse to make them your teacher, to establish a formal relationship of student and teacher, to position yourself at their feet, so to speak, and receive instruction and guidance. And sometimes this is appropriate. Sometimes a genuine teaching relationship can emerge from such encounters, a relationship that serves both parties, that allows for transmission and learning and mutual recognition. But very often the impulse to create a teacher-student relationship is actually another ego defense, another way of managing the discomfort of the encounter. By making them your teacher, you create a structure, a framework, a set of roles and expectations that mediate the rawness of the meeting. You know how to be a student. You know how to be devoted, respectful, receptive. And in adopting this role, you actually create distance, create safety, create a way of relating that does not require you to meet the person as an equal, to be fully present without the protection of defined roles. The more awakened person may or may not want to be your teacher. They may see through your need to make them into something, to fit them into a category, to relate to them through established structures rather than directly, immediately, person to person. And they may decline the role, may refuse to be put on a pedestal, may insist on meeting you as a fellow human being rather than as guru to disciple. This can be frustrating, even infuriating. You want them to teach you, to guide you, to give you the understanding they have. But often what they are actually offering, through their refusal to play the role of teacher, is something more valuable. The invitation to take responsibility for your own awakening, to stop looking outside yourself for someone to give you what you already have, to recognize that what you are seeking in them is actually already present in you, simply hidden beneath your seeking. The 10th thing that can happen in such encounters is that the choices you have made in your life, the way you have structured your existence, the compromises and accommodations and strategies you have adopted, they are suddenly illuminated, revealed in a new light, and often found wanting. The more awakened person may be living very differently from you. They may have made different choices about work, relationships, possessions, lifestyle, and simply witnessing their life, their choices, their way of being, it can throw your own choices into sharp relief. You begin to see where you have compromised your integrity, where you have chosen security over truth, where you have arranged your life around avoiding discomfort rather than embracing what is real. This is not because the person is judging you or criticizing your choices. They may say nothing at all about how you live. But their presence, their example, it acts as a mirror, reflecting back to you the ways in which you are still living from fear, still operating from patterns, still making choices that serve the ego's agenda rather than the truth of your being. And this can be profoundly uncomfortable because you may have elaborate justifications for why you live the way you do, why you maintain the job you do not love, why you stay in the relationship that does not nourish you, why you pursue the goals you do not genuinely care about. You may have convinced yourself that you have good reasons for all of these choices, but in the presence of someone who is actually living from truth, from authenticity, from alignment with their deepest being, all of your justifications and rationalizations become transparent. You see them for what they are: excuses, defenses, ways of avoiding the difficulty and uncertainty that come with actually living truthfully. And this recognition can catalyze change. It can give you the courage to make different choices, to align your outer life with your inner truth, to stop compromising and start living with greater integrity. Or it can simply make you feel badly about your life without leading to any actual change. The recognition itself does not guarantee transformation. That still requires your choice, your action, your willingness to bear the consequences of living differently. The 11th and perhaps most significant thing that happens when you meet someone genuinely more awake than you is that afterwards you cannot go back to where you were before. Even if nothing obvious has changed, even if no great insights have occurred, even if the encounter has simply been uncomfortable and confusing, something has shifted. You have seen something you cannot unsee. You have glimpsed something more, something deeper, something beyond where you currently are, and this glimpse will not leave you. You may try to dismiss it, to minimize it, to convince yourself that the person was not actually more awake, or that if they were, it does not matter, or that you are fine where you are and do not need to go further. But underneath all these defenses, underneath all the ways you try to protect yourself from the implications of the encounter, there is a knowing that will not go away. You have met someone who has traveled further than you. You have touched, however briefly, a quality of consciousness more integrated than your own. And this creates a kind of divine discontent, a restlessness, an inability to settle comfortably back into your previous state. The encounter has opened a door, has shown you a possibility, has planted a seed that will continue to grow whether you attend to it or not. This can be experienced as a gift or as a curse, depending on your relationship to it. If you resist it, if you fight against the changes it wants to catalyze in you, it will feel like a burden, an unwanted disturbance, a disruption of your comfortable spiritual identity. But if you work with it, if you allow it to do its work in you, if you follow where it leads, even when the path is uncertain and uncomfortable, it can be the catalyst for a leap forward, a deepening, a breakthrough that would not have occurred without the encounter. So what does one do when one meets someone more awake than oneself? How does one navigate these encounters skillfully, receive what they have to offer, avoid the pitfalls of idealization and dismissal, and allow the meeting to catalyze genuine transformation? First, recognize what is happening. Understand that the discomfort you feel is not a sign that something is wrong, but a sign that you are being shown something you have not yet seen, that your remaining unconsciousness is being illuminated, that your ego structures are being challenged. Do not pathologize the discomfort. Do not make yourself wrong for feeling it. Simply acknowledge it as part of the process. Second, resist the temptation to defend. Notice when you feel the impulse to prove yourself, to demonstrate your understanding, to match their depth with your own. Notice when you feel the impulse to dismiss them, to find fault, to convince yourself they are not actually more awake than you. These are defenses, and while they may be automatic, you do not have to act on them. You can simply notice them arising and let them be without believing them or following them. Third, be willing to not know. Be willing to be confused, to be uncertain, to be wrong about things you thought you understood. Be willing to be a beginner again, to have your concepts challenged, to discover that what you thought was true is actually just one perspective, one way of seeing, not the whole truth. Fourth, if the person offers something, receive it. Not by making them into your teacher necessarily, not by creating a formal relationship unless that emerges naturally, but simply by being open, receptive, willing to be affected, willing to let their presence work on you in whatever way it wants to work. Fifth, take what the encounter reveals back to your own practice, your own life, your own process. Do not simply admire the person's awakeness from a distance. Use the encounter as a mirror, showing you what remains to be integrated in yourself, what choices need to be reevaluated, what patterns need to be released, what truths need to be embodied, and finally, be grateful. These encounters are rare and precious. Most people never meet someone genuinely more awake than themselves. Most people spend their entire lives in the company of those who are equally or less conscious, never having their assumptions challenged, never seeing what is possible beyond their current state. If you have had such an encounter, recognize it as the gift it is, even if it felt more like a confrontation than a blessing. Because in truth, these encounters, uncomfortable though they may be, are among the most valuable experiences on the spiritual path. They show you what is possible, where you can go, what you might become. They humble you, challenge you, invite you to die and be reborn at a higher level of integration. They strip away your comfortable illusions